Asakamasakamaya Tamaskoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityodhamritam Kamaya Adi Akirvaveti Rudraya Akshinamukam Te Namaha Nityam Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Lead us from the ever-changing to the unchanging. Lead us from the darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge. Lead us from the death of the body to the eternal life of the spirit. Light us through and through, and guide us evermore with thy loving presence. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. I might be getting feedback. Do you think? A little bit? Am I getting feedback? No? Okay. So the topic is Vivekananda's impact on America. When Swami Vivekananda returned to India after his first trip to America, he used to say, "Whatever I had, I have left in that country." During the lectures, a power used to emanate from this body and would infuse the audience. The thought current of the country underwent change, and that was no easy matter. Swami Vivekananda is quoted here by Swami Sardhananda. What does it mean that the thought current of the country underwent a change? The country is America, but what was the thought current of America before Swami Vivekananda came here? And what was the thought current of America after he came here? And how was the change affected? Swamiji said that he could see how events would unfold for the next 1,500 years. For him, Rishi Vivekananda, for him it was child's play to see the thought current of America and the change that he wrought to it. But when Swami Vivekananda said in Swami Premananda's presence, "I can see what's going to happen for the next 1,500 years," when Swami Vivekananda went away, Babaru Maharaj says, I don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. So, for me, this is a really audacious topic. Another way of looking at it is, what would America be like if Swami Vivekananda and his brother monastic disciples and the pioneering swamis of the next generation who established Vedanta centers in America never came here? Another way of looking at the same question. Again, you can see the difficulty. And it's something that I don't really want to think about. I don't want to look at the question in that way. I, of course, wouldn't be here talking to you. This is a topic I would not have chosen. It was rather thrust on me by Swami Tattvayananda this spring. He called up and said, "Oh, good, you answered the phone. I wanted to talk to you. Have you ever visited Shanti Ashram?" No. Shanti Ashram is way out there. It was way out there when this lady in New York gave it to Swami Vivekananda. It was way, and it's still way out there. It's 2 hours and 45 minutes from the San Francisco Center on a Saturday morning. It's surrounded by land that is California Wildlife Preserve. Okay. It's locked. In order to see it, someone who is trusted with the key to the property has to take a day off to get you there to see it and to come back. I had crossed it off my list. He says, "Would you like to see it?" I said, "Yeah." Well, our annual Shanti Ashram retreat, there's one day a year anyone can go. At the end of April, a Saturday, as our Shanti Ashram retreat is coming up, and I've been asking our senior American monks to speak. So, do you think you could come? I said, yeah. I tried not to sound surprised or too excited, but I was. It's not really a speaking thing, we're not, it's mainly to be there and the meditation cabinet that Swami Triyananda, that Swami Trigunatidananda, that Swami Atulananda meditated, and it's still there. But for maybe 30 minutes, speak about Swami Vivekananda's impact on American culture and religion. And he said, you can, take the topic any way you like, deal with it any way you like, whatever perspective you want to. Or he said, you can talk about some other topic as long as it's related to Vivekananda. But I could tell he wanted me to talk on this topic. And I thought, I'm going out to Northern California, where all the research on Swami Vivekananda's stay in the West was done by Gargi, who lived in the convent, and those nuns are all going to be there in the front row. They know. I'm not worried about the monks, I'm worried about the nuns. So I thought, how am I going to handle this? Okay. I want to go. It was a yes, but. But I thought, okay, I'll give this a try. Now the problem with the topic is its subtlety. Swami Vivekananda was talking about and demonstrating by his presence in America a paradigm shift in the perceived nature of reality with a capital R. Reality is not material, as was thought at the time. Reality is not a big Newtonian machine from which consciousness emerges as an accident. Oops. But rather, the paradigm that Vivekananda brought to America is consciousness, and not just consciousness, but loving consciousness, is the reality. This is the subtlest reality. Now, how does that paradigm shift, which Swami Vivekananda brought here, affect our self-understanding as human beings? How does that paradigm shift affect what is to be the goal of human life? And how does that paradigm shift affect the means to attain that goal of human life? Swami Vivekananda spoke about all of that. But it is difficult to trace because of its subtlety. Swami Vivekananda said or did X, and it had Y effect on America. It's really tough. So rather than deal with this topic in broad intellectual strokes, look at vignettes of people who had direct contact with Swami Vivekananda, and not the usual people that we study, like Josephine MacLeod and Mrs. Obi Bull and Sister Christine and Leon Landsberg, and so on and so forth. We'll look at people who had direct contact with Swami Vivekananda and did not become his disciples. How did that contact affect them at the time? And how can we surmise did that contact affect them as their lives unfolded under that influence? The first vignette is a young man in Chicago in 1893, entertaining the possibility of gaining entry to the newly started University of Chicago. He wandered into the Hall of Columbus when Swami Vivekananda was giving his major address on Hinduism. We'll look at his recollections 70 years after the fact, and we'll briefly look at how this young man's life unfolded to guesstimate Swami Vivekananda's influence. The second vignette is of William James. Judging from the written record, they had a warm friendship and were, in contemporary terms, buddies. It wasn't a student-disciple relationship. They were friends. The third vignette is a little further afield. It's about one of Vivekananda's soldiers, one of the pioneering swamis who followed him and established Vedanta centers in America, specifically Swami Sept in St. Louis. The fourth vignette is a bit still farther from direct contact with Swamiji, although Swami Saprakashananda did have direct contact with Swamiji. The fourth vignette is a bit further away. It's about one of Swami Saprakashananda's students, Houston Smith, who wrote the most widely used text on comparative religions used in American universities in the second half of the 20th century. We'll start with William Hawking. This is from the 1963 issue of Vedanta for the West. It's called Recollections of Swami Vivekananda. He starts off tangentially. The being of a person is far from inert. It is something active even when the person is in repose, creating a sort of dynamic field. To be, as a living self, is to be charged with an outgoing energy, wholly independent of effort. He's talking about the effect of our accumulated samskaras. Interesting way to start. And he's putting it completely in an English-American idiom, but not really distorting it. You see, there's a remarkable facility here for expression of subtle things, which is important because what Swami Vivekananda was communicating was very subtle. So this is a very good report on his interaction with Swami Vivekananda. So that's it, okay. We're talking, there's a dynamic field associated with the living self that has an outgoing energy wholly independent of any effort on that person's part. And there are persons with whom one is peculiarly aware of this quiet radiation. To be in their presence, even for a brief time, may leave a lasting impression. Now, on the other side, he says, we all carry about within us unsolved problems of adjustment to this many-angled world. Without necessarily formulating the questions, we are, in fact, living quests. He's talking here about Swadharma. And to meet a person who may resolve a quest wholly without his knowledge, it may simply be his mode of being that brings the release. He's talking about the effect of holy company here. Simply being in his presence and experiencing the effect of their accumulated samskaras may bring a release from some particular vexing, knotty, intractable problem that the other person's facing. This was in some measure the story of my first encounter with Swami Vivekananda, though I was only one of an immense audience. The audience was thousands. I was a casual visitor to the fair, just turning 20, interested in a dozen exhibits on the midway. With special hopes related to the new university nearby, the University of Chicago, whose doors had opened in 1891, I was planning for 5 minutes with President Harper at his roll-top desk in Cobb Hall. But aside from all this, I had a quietly rankling quest of my own. I had been reading Herbert Spencer, all I could get of his works. Spencer's, remember Swami Vivekananda also read Herbert Spencer and corresponded with him. Spencer's first principles had effected an inner revolution in my way of thinking. I was convinced by him, by his arguments for evolution and for a definite rejection of the pretense of belief about things that cannot be known. In other words, Spencer argued against belief in God. This new vista was an intellectual victory, but it was somehow a vital injury for me to think of man as of the animals. Birth, growth, mating, death, and nothing more. Finish. I had, in my religion, Methodism, an experience of conversion with a strange enlightenment which gave me 3 days of what felt like a new vision of things, strangely lifted up. He'd had a spiritual awakening. Spencer had explained all that away as emotional flurry. The world must be faced with a steady objective eye, and the Christian cosmology was fancy. This was his problem. And it's a naughty problem, you see. And it's not dated, except people don't think about it as carefully now as they did. They just reject religion without thinking about it. But he was at least thinking about it. But still, I thought, Christianity is not the only religion. There were to be speakers at the Parliament from other traditions. They might have some insight that would relieve this tension. I would go for an hour to listen. I didn't know the program. It happened to be Vivekananda's talk. The speaker came forward with a calm authority, but also a fraternal at-homeness. Sisters and brothers of America. In an instant, the immense audience was responding with a thunderous physical wave of greeting and recognition of the accent of inner assurance. He spoke not as arguing from a tradition or from a book, but as from an experience and certitude wholly his own. I don't recall the steps of his address, but there was a passage toward the end in which I can still hear the ring of his voice 70 years later, and feel the silence of the crowd, almost as if shocked. The audience was well mixed, but could be taken as one in assuming that there had been a fall of man, the Christian audience. Could be taken as one in assuming that there had been a fall of man, resulting in a state of original sin, such that, quote, all men have sinned and come short of the glory of God, end quote. This is from Romans 3:23, justification by faith. All men have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But what was the speaker saying? I hear his emphatic rebuke. Call men sinners. It is a sin to call men sinners. There was this shocked silence. The way for his essential message was thus perfectly prepared. the main obstacle to his message was identified and attacked with exact aim and power. Like a cruise missile launched, this is my editorial, like a cruise missile launched at the command and control center. Through the silence of the crowd, I felt something like a gasp running through the hall as the audience waited for the affirmation which must surely follow this blow. What his following words were, I cannot recall with the same verbal clarity, but they carried this message, that in all human beings there is that divine essence, undivided and eternal. Reality is one, with a capital O, and that one, which is Brahman, constitutes the central being of each one of us. So he has identified Swami Vivekananda's central message as Advaita. Atman is Brahman. Again, he's expressed it in English, but very faithfully. He's identified his essential message as Advaita. Remember, Swami Vivekananda himself said, I have a message for the West as Buddha had a message for the East. And I think William Hawking has correctly identified it as Advaita. So let's look at two things here. One is the section, the Romans 3:23 that's quoted here, and the other one is what the exact quote from Swami Vivekananda's address on Hinduism. This righteousness from God, this is Romans 3:22 through 4. This righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are saved, that is, justified freely by God's grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. So we're saved from the basic problem of being tainted as human beings by original sin through the intervention of God's Son, Jesus Christ. Well, if we're... And this is how Vivekananda addressed that. A Vedic sage stood up before the world and proclaimed, Hear ye, children of immortal bliss, even ye that reside in higher spheres. I have found the Ancient One, who is beyond all darkness, all delusion. Knowing him alone, you shall be saved from death over and over again. Children of immortal bliss, what a sweet and hopeful name. Allow me to call you brethren by that sweet name, heirs of immortal bliss. The Hindu refuses to call you sinners. Ye are the children of God, the sharers of immortal bliss, holy and perfect beings. Ye divinities on earth, sinners. It is a sin to call a man so. It is a standing libel on human nature. There is such power there. And you can imagine the shocked silence of that audience. But he set it up just right. You wipe out the command and control center, what do you have? You have Advaita. And then you came in with Advaita. What does Advaita do for you? Atman is Brahman. First of all, it knocks out the exclusivity claims of all religions. If our nature, if we are innately pure, perfect, immortal, eternal, heirs to immortal bliss, nothing can take that away from us. Religion can help us uncover it, but nothing can take away what is our own nature. If our own nature is sinful, then we need help. But if we are innately what we are seeking, we are inalienably perfect. Nothing can stop us from our own destiny. It's realizing that. So it knocks out the exclusivity claims of all religions. It puts them on equal footing as being ways to uncover that divinity. It opens the door to a real harmony of religions, not just toleration, but acceptance. It forms a non-contractual basis for morality. I mean, the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament and the New Testament as the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Covenant means contract. It's a contract between God and human beings. Okay, you do this 1 through 10, and I'll take care of you. You don't do this, you're in trouble. I say, it's the I say so code of morality. And it doesn't work very well if people don't believe in God and hell. On the other side, Advaita doesn't need a contract. Morality stems from the nature of reality. Each soul is exactly the same. Each Atman is exactly the same. It's infinite consciousness, infinite bliss, and that is the raison d'etre for all morality. Anything that contradicts that truth, anger, jealousy, hatred, pride, is a form of untruth. And that untruth comes back at us with negative consequences. We don't need someone up there keeping track. It's just that's how reality works. It takes us a very, very long time, lots and lots of experience to figure it out, but eventually everyone figures it out. And it opens the door to the service of human beings as a spiritual practice, which Swami Vivekananda introduced, understanding as he did what was coming, the frenetic pace of life increasing constantly, that we needed a spiritual practice that could be done as we were frenetically busy in this seemingly secular world. So Advaita does all of that. It does much more of that. I just mentioned that. And these are things that we actually need as a human community. It's not East or West anymore so much. It's a human global community. For me, this doctrine was a startling departure from anything which my scientific psychology could then recognize. One must live with these ideas and consider how one's inner experience could entertain them. This is an awesome little sentence, deceptively simple. One must live with these ideas and consider how one's inner experience could entertain them. He's saying the test of the truth of religion is one's inner experience, which is, in fact, the major tenet of Hinduism. But what I could feel and understand at that time was that this man was speaking from what he knew, not from what he'd been told. He was well aware of the books, but he was much more immediately aware of his own experience and his own status in the world. And what he said would have to be taken into account in any final worldview. I realized that Spencer could not be allowed the last word. And furthermore, that this religious experience of mine that I had had in my native religion of Methodism, which Spencer would dismiss as a psychological flurry, was very akin to the grounds of Vivekananda's own certitude. I should tell you at this point that if you look at the unabridged Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, translated by Swami Vivekananda, you look at the back cover, the first blurb back there is by a man named William Ernest Hawking, who was at that time Alfred Professor of Philosophy at Harvard. It's this man. And my suspicion is that it was because of that endorsement by Hawking that Time magazine reviewed this book in 1942. For several years I lost sight of Vivekananda. My pursuit of learning, since the panic of 1893 had wiped out my savings, led me to do my first college work in Iowa rather than Chicago as a student of engineering. Then encountering the work of William James, which further disenchanted me with Spencer, I spent 4 years in Davenport, Iowa, earning money to come east and study at Harvard with William James. During those years, Vivekananda had begun his great work of founding Vedanta centers throughout America. In the course of this work, he came to Cambridge. I heard him twice, once in a class in metaphysics that was publicly held, once at the home of Mrs. Ole Bull on Brattle Street. It was in these informal gatherings that the quality of the man most directly spoke, and I was confirmed in my regard for him and my purpose to rethink my philosophical foundations. My work at the great Department of Philosophy at Harvard, it was the greatest philosophy department in the country at the time, head and shoulders. My work with Royce, Josiah Royce, as well as William James, Palmer, Dickinson, and Miller, and others of the great department at the turn of the century, gave me the mental tools for conceiving a world unity in terms of spirit rather than in terms of a redistribution of matter and motion. So he was influenced by Vivekananda before he entertained a formal study of philosophy. But he worked out his quest in terms of the best Western philosophy that was available to him at the time. So it's a combination of East and West. All these experiences naturally made the idea of a journey to India an attractive dream. The time came for its unexpected realization in connection with a certain layman's inquiry, which took me in 1931 and 32 first to London, where I met Gandhi, and then to Calcutta, visiting other places. You see, he was a big man at this time, so he would meet Gandhi. And when he was in Calcutta, he met the big people there. In Calcutta, visiting, among other places, the Beller Mat, where Josephine MacLeod and Francis Leggett had helped to promote the great training ground for the followers of the Ramakrishna movement. It was like going to Beller Mat was like returning to the rootage after many excursions in the fruitage. Tanti had in the meantime become a warm personal friend, and in those sacred precincts of Beller Mat, my wife and I found ourselves very much at home. Hawking was a lifelong friend of the Vivekananda movement in America. These reflections reveal that. While in India, I first met Sarvapalli Radhakrishna, then Jawaharlal Nehru, the poet Rabindranath Tagore, and Surendranath Dasgupta, the great historian of Vedanta. These unfading friendships and the continuing associations with the Vedanta centers near us in America, and especially with Tanti while she lived, have helped keep the memory and the spirit of Swami Vivekananda alive in our lives, meaning in the lives of he and his wife. Now, I did a little research on Hawking. He spent 1902 and 1903 studying in Germany at Göttingen, Berlin, and Heidelberg. He was the first American student to study with Husserl in Göttingen. Edmund Husserl was the founder of the philosophical school Phenomenology. And this is a school of philosophy that states that philosophy is really a study of consciousness. So he got in on the ground floor in Western philosophy. He returned to Harvard to take his PhD in 1904, and then became an instructor of comparative religion at Andover Theological Seminary. In 1906, Hawking joined the philosophy department at UCal Berkeley. During this time, they had a big earthquake. You remember Swami Trigunatidananda was there in San Francisco at the time. Hawking took part in the rebuilding of San Francisco after the great earthquake and subsequent fire. He was also an engineer by training, and he was not an armchair philosopher. He had the skills, and the skills were needed, and he got up off his academic behind and he went out and did something. And we don't know whether he knew that Swami Trigunatita was in the area. That I wasn't able to search that out. But there he was, with his shirt sleeves rolled up, helping rebuild San Francisco. He went from Berkeley to Yale, and it was there that he wrote his major work, The Meaning of God and Human Experience. And that work is what brought him to Harvard in 1914, where he eventually became the Alfred Professor of Natural Religion, Moral Philosophy, and Civil Polity at the death of Josiah Royce. In 1917, he went to England and France as a member of the first detachment of American military engineers to reach the front in World War II. He was, how old was he at that time? 17. He was 44 years old at the time and certainly not draftable. He went there because he thought he should. Again, he's not an armchair philosopher. In 1918, his appointment as Inspector of War Issues led to the publication of his book, Morale and Its Enemies. He returned to Harvard after the war. Now, he took another leave. He's taken 2 leaves from his academic works, once to rebuild San Francisco and once to help at the front of World War II as a military engineer. World War I, yes, sorry. From 1930 to 1932, and this is referred to in his reminiscences, from 1930 to 1932, Hawking was largely occupied with the chairmanship of the Committee of Appraisal, a study by laymen of the foreign mission work of 6 Protestant denominations in India, Burma, China, and Japan. The results were published in 6 volumes in a report called Rethinking Missions and produced a lively debate. Now, the denominations that were involved were Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Congregational, and Episcopal. And these are excerpts from the report which Hawking edited. And these are things which the excerpts are things that Hawking actually wrote. The concluding report sought a, quote, world understanding on a spiritual level, unquote. Spiritual understanding was to be the objective of Christian missions. These missions, quote, ought not to operate in hostility to other world religions, nor seek to displace them, unquote. Hawking added the idea of the new missionary as an ambassador of Christianity, as a resident interpreter of the Western traditions in Eastern countries, and eventually the reporter to his or her homeland of the older and newer religious currents in Asia. In other words, he's suggesting that the Christian missionaries behaved in India, China, Burma, and Japan as the Vedanta missionaries behave in America and Europe. Hocking upheld Christian testimony in non-Christian lands, but he felt that it was important for the churches and all of the church missionaries to realize that, quote, Christianity is as yet unready as a world religion. That means a universal religion, a triumphant religion which just overpowers every other religion. Christianity is as yet unready as a world religion, for the standards we profess as Christians are not the positions which we have attained. In many ways, Christianity as a conception is further from the behavior of the Christian world than it is from the behavior of portions of the Orient. Whoa, talk about truth to power. You can imagine this produced a lively debate. I was so happy to find something that I could tell the nuns in San Francisco that they didn't already know.
Your whole goal was to impress the nuns.
Without the nuns, this never would have happened. It wasn't to impress the nuns. It wasn't to be. It was so that I wasn't embarrassed in front of them. Would Dr. Hocking have been so respectful of Eastern traditions and so broad in his recommendations to Protestant missionaries working in India, Burma, Japan, and China if he had not met Swami Vivekananda? Even with the question narrowed down to an individual, it's still hard to prove definitively. He wrote 22 major books on philosophy. He was one of the great philosophers of the first half of the 20th century. So to really research this, you have to do a lot of work. But my suspicion is that Swami Vivekananda had a lifelong influence on Professor Hocking's views of religion, the philosophy of religion, and the proper conduct and attitude of Christian missionary work. Okay. What happened to the middle part? Excuse me here. Did I leave that upstairs? Oh, here we are. No, I did. I looked upstairs. Excuse me. I don't want to break from memory. I'll be right back. Can you hold on?
Yesterday you said stay tuned.
Get back in position here. Okay. So, Professor William James and Vivekananda were warm personal friends. They met in Cambridge in 1894 and 1896. Their first meeting was for dinner at the house of Mrs. Foley Ball, and they continued their conversation till after midnight, privately, just the two of them. James was in his 50s when he first met Swamiji. His Principles of Psychology had been published in 1890, and he was one of the academic stars at Harvard, not just in the philosophy department. James quoted Swami Vivekananda's published talks 3 times in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. James called Vivekananda a man of genius, an orator by divine right, an honor to humanity. When he wrote in 1896 inviting Swami Vivekananda to his home, the greeting was, "Dear Master." Swami Vivekananda called James a very nice man, a very nice man. Now, I should say that I'm going to read the letter that he wrote so you can get a feeling for the tone of their relationship. 95 Irving Street, Cambridge, March 28, 1896. Dear Master. Now, I looked this up. It doesn't mean that he's considering him his spiritual master as we do in India. It's not like saying Thakur. Master, the term at that time, it was used when addressing a revered religious personality. So he's just honoring his status as a religious teacher, not necessarily as a student of his. Dear Master, I hate not to have any conversation with you before you leave Cambridge. I am willing to give up 2 engagements I have this afternoon for the sake of meeting you, if you yourself should be free between 4 and 6:30 p.m. Or, if it suits you better, can you lunch with me tomorrow at 1 p.m.? Or, can you dine with me at 6 this evening and still be in time for your talk at 8 p.m.? Pray choose one of these alternatives and let the messenger, my son, know which you choose. A verbal message will suffice. In case you choose this afternoon at 4, pray, say whether you prefer to come to my house or to have me call at Mrs. Bowles. I can do either, but naturally, I should like to see you for once under my own roof. If I go to Mrs. Bowles, I may not be there before 4:30. If you stay to dinner tonight, pray, come as early in the afternoon as you possibly can. Sincerely yours, William James. It was carried by his teenage son. So they had a warm, personal relationship. They really liked each other. But that doesn't mean that James accepted Vivekananda's philosophy. He was a philosopher, and philosophers, when William James's Gifford lectures were about to be published as the varieties of religious experience, he wrote from Edinburgh to Mrs. Bull in a letter dated June 5th, 1902. This was a couple weeks before Vivekananda died. Quote, will you kindly send me Vivekananda's address so that I can address Vivekananda's address so that I may order a copy of my lectures sent to him. My lectures will seem half-hearted stuff, I know, to him. They've appointed a, quote, safe man to give the next Gifford lectures. I think I wrote you earlier that I, italicized, nominated Vivekananda, who was a man of genius, to give the next set of lectures, even though his absolute, with a capital A, be not the truth. And some people mistakenly think that William James practiced the yoga disciplines, because he certainly regarded them with respect. But in a letter to a Polish philosopher, James wrote in probably 1906, you are mistaken about my having tried yoga discipline. I never meant to suggest that. I have read several books, and in the slightest possible way, tried breathing exercises. These breathing exercises go terribly against the grain with me, and are extremely disagreeable. And even when tried this winter, the winter of 1905-1906, somewhat perseveringly, in order to put myself to sleep after lying awake at night, failed miserably to have any soporific effect. Now, Vivekananda did give a major address on the philosophy of non-dualism at Harvard at William James' invitation. So, philosophical monism, as articulated by Swami Vivekananda, entered into the conversation at the Harvard philosophy department. It was there, and they had to deal with it. And James's way of dealing with it was to argue against it and say it is not the truth. But they all had their different ways of dealing with it. But it was something that they had to deal with. So even though James did not accept Vivekananda's philosophy, didn't swallow it hook, line, and sinker, there were certain things that he liked very much. It's not to say that they had no influence on each other. There's always some influence when people who think deeply and are engaged in serious conversation, when they have this dialogue. On Swami Vivekananda's part, when he talked about brain function in his commentary on Raja Yoga, he expressed it in ways that were correct scientifically at the time. And he could have refined this very easily talking to James, because James was a medical doctor first, and a psychologist, and a philosopher second and third. So this, in 1889, there's a book by William James published called Talks to Teachers. It was probably talks to high school teachers at exclusive private schools in and around Boston. And this is an excerpt which I found when I was a university student and never could locate again. But when I had to do the research for this talk, it took about 5 minutes on Google to pull it up. Okay, here we go. He's speaking to these high school teachers. We forget that every good that is worth possessing must be paid for in strokes of daily effort. We postpone and postpone until those smiling possibilities are dead. Whereas 10 minutes a day of poetry, of spiritual reading, or of meditation, provided we begin now and suffer no remission, would infallibly give us in due time the fullness of all we desire. By sparing ourselves the little daily tax, we are positively digging the graves of our own higher possibilities. This is a point concerning which you teachers might well give a little timely information to your older and more aspiring pupils. Paragraph. According as a function receives daily exercise or not, the person becomes a different kind of being in later life. Now here's what we've all been waiting for. We have lately had a number of accomplished Hindu visitors at Cambridge who talked freely of life and philosophy. By this time, Vivekananda, Vedanta, and Saradananda had already been to Cambridge. More than one of them has confided to me that the sight of our faces, American faces, all contracted as they are with the habitual American overintensity and the habitual American anxiety of expression, and our ungraceful and distorted postures when sitting, made on him a very painful impression. Quote, I do not see, said one, how it is possible for you to live as you do without a single minute of your day deliberately given to tranquility and meditation. It is an invariable part of our Hindu life to retire at least half an hour daily into silence, to relax our muscles, to regulate our breathing, and to meditate on eternal things. Every Hindu child is trained to this from a very early age. End quote. The good fruits of such a discipline were obvious in the physical repose and lack of tension, and the wonderful smoothness and calmness of facial expression, and the imperturbability of manner of these Orientals. I felt that my countrymen were depriving themselves of an essential grace of character. How many American children ever hear it said by parent or teacher that they should moderate their piercing voices, that they should relax their unused muscles, and as far as possible, when sitting, sit quite still. Not 1 in 1,000, not 1 in 5,000. Yet, from its reflex influence on the inner mental states, this ceaseless overtension, overmotion, and overexpression are working on us grievous national harm. Now, you can see there was an influence here. And to me, this quote that we just looked at, it sounds a lot like how Vivekananda put together sentences in the English language. There's a rhythm and a force and a cadence to it that just screams Swamiji. So there's one example of Vivekananda's influence. Now, now, you're still with me? You're still tuned? This is Swami Satprakashananda. Swami Satprakashananda saw Vivekananda when he visited Dhaka in March of 1901. Swami was 12 or 13 years old, probably 12. He saw Vivekananda on 3 different days. Each visit was very short, but he later said, "It left a very indelible impression upon my mind, which has been a source of inspiration all the years, and has been at the back of all that I have that is great and good in me." So this is an article that appeared in the 1993 Prabhupada Bharata, written by Marie Louise Burke. Swami Satprakashananda went to St. Louis in 1938 from San Francisco. Swami Ashokananda was his buddy. And after an evening class at the old temple, Swami Ashokananda announced, "This Swami is going to St. Louis to start the Vedanta work. Does anyone know anyone in St. Louis who could help him?" And Belle Martin said, "Yes, my sister Anna Steinmesh lives there. And although she's not interested personally in Vedanta, she respects it. And I can say without talking to her that she will help the Swami get started and do whatever she can to help. Our mother heard Swami Vivekananda at the Parliament of Religions, and we've been aware of him all our lives." So Mrs. Steinmesh met Swami at the station, got him in a hotel. And in this 1951 was his first visit back to San Francisco after that 1938 departure. Gargi writes, "On the evening of September 4th, 1951, when we, 9 or 10 students of the Vedanta Society of Northern California, had gathered to meet the Swami informally in the small library of the old temple, we asked him to tell us of his early years in St. Louis, with the utmost cheerfulness, and as though he were speaking of someone else. He told us something of the way it had been. So I went there," the Swami said, "unasked and unknown. The sister, willing to do all she could to help, though she herself was not personally interested, met him at the train and took him to a hotel. Her next step was the logical one of introducing him to several of her friends who might conceivably be interested. Among those people were a young couple and the mother of the wife, the last of whom, quote, caught on, as the Swami said. The couple themselves did not want to become Vedantins, but they offered to do all they could to help me. They were very willing, but the mother-in-law was interested at once, and she is still a devoted student. Swami went himself to the editors of the 2 large newspapers in St. Louis to insert notices of his talks, and it was there that he ran into opposition. The first editor, he told us, just looked at me without moving any part of his face. He said, "We don't want that kind of stuff in St. Louis. We are on to your rackets." A chorus of indignation arose in the library. "What did you say? What did you say? What did you do?" The Swami laughed. "What should I say? He did not want that kind of stuff. Why should I argue with him?" I went to the editor of the other paper, but it was the same story. He did not want that stuff either. The Swami continued, "One can't blame them. There had been many fake Swamis in St. Louis who had cheated people. They were naturally suspicious." He had the name of the subscriber to the Prabhupada Bharata. It was in St. Louis. His name was Hilmar Harold. He got the address and he went over unannounced. The Swami went to the man's house and found him digging in his front garden. As the Swami introduced himself, the man, heavy-set, middle-aged, and wearing a somewhat truculent face, leaned on his shovel and eyed the slender, boyish-looking Hindu over the picket fence. "What kind of Swami are you? A real Swami or a fake Swami?"
Fake Swami.
"I'm a real Swami." "Have you ever heard of Sri Ramakrishna?" "I am a monk of the order of Sri Ramakrishna." The man narrowed his eyes and looked at him. "We've had many fake Swamis here. We don't want any more of them. They're after one thing, money. If you are a real Swami, and if you are a monk of the Ramakrishna order, as you say you are, can you tell me the esoteric meaning of this passage?" He quoted a verse from the Katha Upanishad. "Tell me," said Mr. Harold. "You say you've studied the Vedanta and that you are a Vedanta Swami. Can you explain the meaning of this verse? The good is one and the pleasant another. Both of these, serving different needs, bind a man. It goes well with him who, of the two, takes the good, but he who chooses the pleasant misses the end." The Swami immediately recited the verse in Sanskrit and replied, "Yes, I can explain." "Well," said Mr. Harold in surprise, "you're one in a million." "I am." Mr. Harold leaned his shovel on the fence, opened the gate, took the Swami inside his home, and called someone on the phone, who later brought the Swami a list of 800 people who might be candidates for Vedanta. When he told this story, when Swami told this story in later days, he says that Mr. Harold said, you're one in a million." Swami said, he kind of laughed and he said, "My egotism was aroused." I am. Why would they send me over here to America? Unless I'm qualified, Mr. Harold didn't become personally interested in Vedanta. He had, some people are intellectually interested, they never kind of make that step and get over to the other side. He didn't embrace the Vedanta personally. And they asked him in the library about this. The Swami said, I never urge anyone. I offer Vedanta. It's up to the person to take it or not. One can never force people. A person who is not yet through with the world should satisfy his or her desires and get them out of their system. It is of no use telling people to renounce before they're ready. If there can be small but loyal groups, that is enough. From there, spirituality will spread and affect many. There was an Episcopalian minister, not a minister. He finished a class one night, and some of these people that were helping him were there with him. This young couple that were doing errands for him and so forth. Got a phone call from someone who had met the Swami, was casually interested, but he was in kind of the high society. And he was calling from a party, and he sounded slightly inebriated. And he said, can Swami come over and talk to people? Okay. And Swami was, he was saying no, but the couple could hear the conversation. They knew where he was, and he said, no, Swami, you should go over there. So he put on his street clothes, and he went over. And it's a mansion where he went, quite near where the society is presently located. And there were a bunch of society people, and he said the ladies were all dressed like fairy princesses. They had on their evening clothes. And he said, frankly, they were probably bored, and so they were drinking and dancing. Anyway, with all enthusiasm, he sat down and talked about Vedanta, and he said most of them couldn't care less, but a few were interested, and one became interested. And there was an Episcopalian businessman who took him home, offered him a ride back. And as they drove back to the hotel, they talked together of religion, the Swami telling of his proposed work in America. Suddenly, the businessman pulled over to the curb and in a voice choked with emotion said, Swami, I believe you're a saint. You're a saint, Swami. You're a saint. Swami says, I need help. He says, Swami, I'm sorry, he says, I'm an Episcopalian. I didn't know that an Episcopalian couldn't help a saint. So, by living with extreme thrift, Swami was able to eat and continue his talks, but those were hard days. He told of that early period so cheerfully that one might imagine it had been a great lark. Only once did he give some indication of how difficult those times had been, and this not to relate his own moments of discouragement, but to point out the greatness of his master, Sri Ramakrishna. Going from the lecture hall to my small bedroom and out again to meet someone, and in again, I would feel that none of it was of any purpose. There was no one who really cared about all these comings and goings. There was great loneliness in it. For whom was I doing it, and why? Gripped by this sense of loneliness and a sense of futility, he turned to the one sure thing, Sri Ramakrishna. It then dawned on me, he continued, that Sri Ramakrishna was of course everywhere. He was with me in the lecture hall, with me in my room, with me, always. And it was he for whom I was doing all this, for none else. To the Swami this came as a vivid experience, not as a matter of thought. And from that time, as though he had stepped aside, allowing Sri Ramakrishna to work, his heart lifted and the work began to take shape and flow effortlessly and meaningfully. Someone among us asked the question, do you work, Swami, because you love mankind? The question made him shudder slightly. No, he said. I do not love mankind. This answer caused a moment of stunned silence in the library. Here was a man with love bright in his face saying he did not love mankind. He went on. When one has made oneself an instrument of God's love, one does not go about loving mankind as a business. Neither is this love an expression of sentiment. It is spontaneous and unself-conscious. A mother does not consider service to her child to be an act of charity. She is simply doing what is her greatest pleasure to do, what is most natural for her to do. The expression of real love is never deliberated. It is always spontaneous. Never think you are helping others. Who are you to help anyone? Who needs your help if all are God's? Do not degrade another by thinking you can help him or her, setting yourself off as better. When you have understood real love, you will never fail to do the right thing for people. You will never fail to give them real help. So that was an assimilated statement of Vivekananda's method of operation. That is directly, pretty much from Vivekananda's Karma Yoga, but we're talking about an assimilated and practiced Karma Yoga. The last vignette is Houston Smith, who was sent to Swami Satpakashananda by his mentor, Gerald Hurd, in 1947, in connection with Houston's appointment to the Philosophy Department of Washington University in St. Louis. Houston wrote the most widely used American college text on comparative religion used in the second half of the 20th century. It was published in 1958, and in the acknowledgments of the 1991 revised edition, it states, the chapter that remains closest to its version in the first edition is the one on Hinduism, which retains the authoritative stamp of Swami Satpakashananda, who was then the spiritual director of the Vedanta Society of St. Louis. Here's how it happened. Houston Smith was Swami Satpakashananda's student, but not his disciple. Swami gave Houston instructions in meditation, but not formal diksha. For 10 years, Houston came on Wednesdays from 11 a.m. to noon for a tutorial on the Vedanta. Swami would give him readings each week, and Houston would come back the following week with questions and discussion. He got a real in-depth study of Hinduism from a practicing mystic, from a scholar's scholar. Dr. Smith was at the same time teaching world religions at Washington University, not originally by choice, but because as the new and lowest man on the totem pole in the philosophy department, he was stuck with it. Houston, out of this collaboration came the first public television course in this country. It was on world religions. It was taught by Houston Smith. Swami Satpakashananda was the last speaker in the course. He took the entire last hour of the program. And in 1958, a world religion text called The Religions of Man, later retitled as The World's Religion. Houston's last visit to St. Louis was in 2005 for a function. He was in his 80s at the time, for a function at the Fine Arts Museum. After the function, We were casually talking outside the museum when that book came up in conversation. Houston casually mentioned, the whole book is written, of course, from the perspective of the Vedanta. Reading the book, one suspects that, but I had never heard Houston state it explicitly. Written from the perspective of Vedanta to me means, 1, all religions are valid. 2, the mystic experience is at the heart of each religion. 3, each religion helps its sincere adherents to reach that mystic state, although specific practices differ from religion to religion. Houston was and is, through his literary work, such a master teacher that students who go through that book generally come away with an understanding of those 3 points and an appreciation of each of the religions, and probably pass that on to their children. Connecting the dots, I see that in some way, as an extension of Swami Vivekananda's work in America, and an impact of that Vedanta on America. So, that's it. Oh, the kids have been waiting so patiently. I think we need to go to the children. Okay. The kids have the kids have